Good afternoon. Welcome to our last Lunch Learn of the season. We are talking about the City of Milwaukee's new landscape code. It's just put into application, what was it, May or March? I think it was March of this year. It's in the slideshow, so we'll figure it out. Welcome once again. We are welcome to have Kyle here from DCD and Ed to help go over the new arrangements of the landscape code and some other zoning issues. Alderwoman Coggs may show up or not, depending on the budget hearings. So, welcome, and here's Kyle.
Thank you, Alex. Well, welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm Kyle Gast. I'm a planner here at the Department of City Development for the City of Milwaukee. I'm joined by my colleague, Ed Richardson. Ed is our liaison to the Board of Zoning Appeals. He deals with the zoning code in depth every day. So in the event that I am not able to answer any of your questions, Ed is here to back me up on that. And I will also stress, today I want to talk about the landscape code because that's the biggest and most recent change that we've done. But also, if you have questions about zoning in general, any other updates, any other detail to the zoning code, we'll be happy at the end to take those questions as well. And if I can't answer them, Ed is here to talk about that as too. So the Milwaukee Landscape Code. Talk a little bit. The landscape code is really the requirements that we have for various uses, specifically, especially parking lots, that we require landscaping for. We've required landscaping in some form or another for a long time. I think the early 1980s was the first code that included parking lot landscaping. And it is part of the City of Milwaukee's zoning code, as I mentioned before. So the zoning code, you can find it in the city charter. It's chapter 295, but the Department of City Development on our planning website, we have a shortcut as well. You can find it really easily, milwaukee.gov/zoning code. And again, specifically, it's subchapter 4. So the zoning code has different chapters for different districts. So depending on what district you are in, determines what chapter you go to. But there's a chapter called chapter 4 that applies to all districts. And the landscape standards are part of that subchapter. So if you're looking to read the actual text, you can. And real quick, does everyone have one of these? Did you get one of these on the way in? If not, maybe Alex can get you one. So that's a guide we put together to help explain to property owners specifically what we're asking for when we talk about landscaping. It's really just the surface. The code itself is much more detailed, and that's kind of why I walk through where to find it, because there's all sorts of exceptions and other things that the code will talk about that aren't in the guidebook. But real quickly, when we took on this challenge of updating this section of the code, the impetus really came out of the local business action team. Excuse me. So back in 2015, the city convened a group of stakeholders, local officials, business leaders. Several of the aldermen were on that board and they called it the Local Business Action Team, which is really looking for a way to streamline rules and regulations, among other things, to make things easier for small businesses going forward. And one of their key requirements was produce a guide to tell people what we're asking for when we talk about landscaping, and take a look at the landscape requirements themselves, see if there's a way to simplify this so that people actually know what they're required to do. So really, some major goals coming out of that were simplify the code. It was very intimidating to try to understand what people were required to do, as well as build flexibility into the code. And simplicity and flexibility aren't always friends, so sometimes it's hard to make things simple and flexible. And then again, provide solutions for existing sites. So Milwaukee, we're a built-out city. We don't have a lot of brand new greenfield developments. A lot of times we're dealing with small properties, small parking lots that weren't built with landscaping in mind, and they have to be retrofitted to accommodate landscaping. On top of those, what I call kind of customer service goals, there's the urban design goals. Those are really the primary focus of the former code. We don't want to abandon our urban design goals per se, which is all about the pedestrian environment, that street edge. If you think of a typical urban main street, North Avenue, Brady Street, those types of streets, over time, some of those buildings come down and they turn into parking lots. And you get that kind of cliche, the missing tooth on the street wall sort of thing. So the purpose of our landscape code, up until now is solely pretty much to mitigate that condition, to sort of hold that street edge, keep cars from pulling onto the sidewalk, to kind of keep that nice edge to define the street, kind of the principles of urban design, to define the street, make the street more pedestrian friendly. Generally that involved a low hedge, 3 feet or less, a crown of trees above 6 feet, and then generally that 3 to 6 feet you want to be able to see in and out. So we're not necessarily trying to hide the parking lot. We want to see in and out. We just want to define the spaces, provide that nice street edge, which was lost when those buildings came down and were turned into parking. And then equally as important, or possibly more important, becoming more and more important nowadays, especially since the last code was revised, is environmental goals, right? We all know that Milwaukee is going to continue to see more intense storms. And if we want to, we can either try to build our way out with increased sewer capacity, more deep tunnels, or we can take the approach of green infrastructure, which we're kind of doing across citywide. We've recently updated our Chapter 120 stormwater requirements. But the idea that there's an environmental purpose, not just a design purpose to this landscaping. So how do we encourage properties to capture rainfall, rainwater where it falls, keep it out of the combined sewer system, keep the crud from getting into our rivers and getting into our lakes so we can protect those resources for many generations to come. And so that was interwoven into this as well. So part of the reason why I show these kind of 3 types of goals were to say that they don't always go hand in hand, right? So it's hard to make things, to be good for to save the environment and go easy on business, and or to provide that urban edge, but also capture stormwater. So that's kind of just lays the framework for when we went about developing this code, why when we put something in there, we made it sure it was important for a specific purpose. So back to the customer service element real quickly. When people were formally, and I don't expect you to read anything on here, just to as a message to see how this was the old table, see how intimidating it could be when you were first told that, oh, your parking lot has to comply with 295, 405 of the landscape code or the zoning code. This is the first table you would be pointed to. And generally you had to figure out what use you were trying to screen, what zoning district you were in, and depending on that there are various types. Some types are prohibited, some types are required. You generally have a type required and then a type allowed, and if one's required, how can another one be allowed? And then it wasn't always the clearest to understand, especially for small business owners that were trying to do a small project. But this table is just to figure out which type you may need to have. Once you figured that out, then you went to this table, which is equally as intimidating and very prescriptive, and it kind of grew over time as we tried to build in that flexibility. We tried to build in new types, and sometimes they contradicted each other, and there were asterisks, and things grew over time. So when looking at how we could look at this code and make it more user-friendly, we kind of made the decision to, well, let's just start from scratch and let's think about what's really important. So that's the new table. It's a much bigger, much more contrast, and there's no types, there's options. So if you have a parking lot, you have basically 3 options that you can do. It's the same citywide. So there's no different standards for our more suburban districts than our urban districts. There's options. And depending on your specific site and the needs of your specific site, you pick which option works best for you, or a combination of them. So you may have a site that's in a suburban district, but you're just really tight for space. You have a small site, it happens to be in a more suburban district, or vice versa, in an urban district. You have the space to provide that green space. We should promote that and incentivize that if you can do it. We require screening, mostly, landscaping along the street edge for a lot of uses. Today I'm going to focus on parking lots, because that's what we deal with every day. That's the most common thing, and that's what the guide is designed to address is landscaping and screening for parking lots. There's also a series of other uses, outdoor salvage, things like that require landscaping and screening. But you'll have to go to the code to figure that out. But today we're talking about parking lots. Basically, there's 3 requirements. There's screening from public streets. So that's really that urban design, that pedestrian friendly, making the city look good, landscaping along public streets. There's screening from residential districts, which is basically about protecting a neighbor from what might be going on in the parking lot, from headlight glare, from noise, dust, those types of things. A subtle but key change in this is it's screening from residential districts. It used to be screening from residential uses, which meant if you had a home in a commercial district next to you, you'd have to screen that home, even though you're both in it could be a dense local business district. Now, if you have a residential use in a local business district, which is allowed and encouraged, but you're in a commercial district. So there's screening, we're protecting residential districts from commercial districts and industrial districts. And the last is landscaping and green infrastructure overall. Now, your screening from streets and districts counts towards that overall landscaping, which is another key change that I'll get into in a little bit. Real quickly, screening from public streets. Why? Why do we require that? Well, it's about promoting a well-defined and pedestrian-friendly public realm and making sure the city looks nice. So we can't just pave up to the sidewalk everywhere, because if it happens here or there, it can get by. But when you have whole corridors where it's just asphalt, where the building edge has been eroded and that's not mitigated, it's really hard to make a nice, vibrant, pedestrian-oriented district. And similarly, it's hard even in suburban areas when you have that. It just doesn't look attractive. So that edge is really key. And it's required when the parking lot is less than 20 feet from the street property line. So if you have the space and you want to set your parking lot back 20 feet from the property line, this doesn't apply to you. But you have that, because that's a benefit for having that space, that pervious surface in between, where you can accomplish some other landscaping. So this is the table from the guidebook. You can look along in the guidebook, but basically it's 3 options. Option A is a nice, generous border. You don't need any fence. That was a big thing. We used to require fences in almost all of our districts, and a lot of people gave feedback saying, why do you require the fence? It has no ecological function. It's not sucking carbon. It's not sucking stormwater. Why do you have the fence? It gets knocked over. Of course, the architects would say, well, that fence is key to creating that urban edge, So as a trade-off now, if you give us a nice, generous border, big enough where the trees are actually going to thrive, they're not going to be these twigs. They actually grow into nice, mature trees. You don't need the fence. The second option, if you have a more standard border like we've always required, you give us that decorative metal fence and your trees. It's similar to what we currently have, less shrubs, about half as many shrubs as we used to require. The former code had something like 2 rows of shrubs spaced 4 feet on center in each row and something like that. So it was very prescriptive. It basically mandated a hedge, right? So hedges are nice. We like hedges. If you want to do a hedge, you're more than welcome to. But what happens if 5 years later, one of the shrubs dies and it comes out and all of a sudden that person's non-compliant with the code? So we said, in the spirit of flexibility, allowing landscape architects creativity, of course you can provide us a hedge, but that's not all you can do. You can do other things. And one thing we added is you can now do ornamental grasses. You can do perennials. So there's a variety of ways you can meet that lower edge. It's less shrubs. And option C is just a masonry wall, a low masonry wall. You don't need any landscaping at all on the ground. You do need trees every 40 feet. But you'll have to make up for that landscaping elsewhere, as you'll see when we go to the overall requirements. Again, that's A, B, and C. 3 options, citywide, for parking lots. Doesn't matter if you're in LB1 or RB2, or if you have a parking lot for a grocery store or an apartment building. It's just the same across the board. If you have a parking lot and you're in the city of Milwaukee, you pick one or a combination of these options along whenever your parking lot is less than 20 feet from a public street. So option A, as I said, a nice wide border, no fence, shrubs, perennials, or grasses, or a combination. This shows a little bit more robust than we'd actually require, and a row of trees. Another thing about the trees is we do require 1 tree every 20 feet of frontage, but they don't have to be 20 feet on center. So you take the 20 feet of, take how much frontage you have, divide it by 20, and that's how many trees you have, and you can group them. You can put them wherever they're going to grow the best. Put them where they're going to thrive. There are some limits on how far you can go without a tree. And another key point is the trees in the right-of-way now count. So, we heard a lot about, we'll have a street tree there. I can't plant trees because they're going to get shaded out. And we can debate whether that's true and what type of species can do, but then it would go to, then it generates a board of zoning appeals case that here, so it's just like, no, if you have, and we talked about should a tree count half a tree but if you have a tree in the right of way, it counts. So now if that tree later gets cut down, you wouldn't be in compliance any longer, but that comes specifically in handy when you do that option C and you don't have the space to deal with. And you can, so it counts in the public right of way. We went back and forth about whether that should be the case. Option B again. Option C, and these are all pages straight out of the guidebook that you have in front of you, so you can kind of take a look. The next type of requirement, screening from residential districts. So this is less about the street edge, about the urban design, quality of public space. This is about protecting neighbors from noise, dust, headlight glare, those types of things. And the old code would basically require a wood fence and a row of tall shrubs or evergreen trees. You can still do that now. That's option B. These options are very similar to same concept as the last ones, right? But option A would be, well, give us a more generous border where you can really grow that dense vegetation. We don't need a fence. Or if you just don't have the space, put up a masonry wall, something that's going to be permanent, that can give us confidence that that residential district will be protected. So again, now in the street edge landscaping, we want visibility. We want to be able to, we don't want to hide the parking lot. We want to define the spaces. In the street edge landscaping, we want to be able to see in. When you're protecting from a residential property, we want opacity. And this is also the case when we're screening salvage yards or things that, kind of things that where we don't want to see versus things we want to see. In the street edge, we want to see in. We want to see what's going on, both, if you're we want that visibility, we just want to define the space. But when we're screening from residential districts, we want a barrier. Overall landscaping. Now, the purpose of this really focuses on that environmental goal aspect, right? This is about improving water quality in the rivers, lakes, in Lake Michigan. This is about reducing floods, reducing the city's long-term obligation for our sewer maintenance, and to make us a more resilient city for what's known and unknown that'll come. This is a diagram that was created for something else, but I want to show it because our old code really differentiated really strongly between interior landscaping and perimeter landscaping. So if it required 1 tree for every 4 parking spaces in the parking lot itself. Very ambitious target, very hard to meet if you can imagine. If you can picture a parking lot with 1 tree every 4 spaces, it'd be beautiful. but very difficult to achieve in the parking lot. You plant a tree next to the parking lot, it didn't count. Even, so we got a lot of these little 5x5 boxes, right, with the twig in it. It gets covered in snow, right? But you could have a grove of trees next to the parking lot thriving. That didn't count. So the areas in yellow were that kind of interior landscaping. And, when they wrote that, it was really about making those regimented islands. So we let off that a little bit. Our requirement now for landscaping is overall, whether it's, if you want to put in islands in the parking lot, that's great. If you put it next to the parking lot, that's great too. Put it where it's going to grow. Put the tree where it can survive the best. So we still require one tree for 4 spaces, but now it's an aggregate. So all those trees along the street edge that didn't used to count, now they count. Okay? And you can put them anything within 50 feet of the parking lot. So if it's within 50 feet of the parking lot, it counts, even if it's in the right of way. And we now introduced green infrastructure. So green infrastructure is not required. I would argue trees are green infrastructure, right? But if you don't have the space, or you don't want to plant all those trees, you can reduce that requirement by adding some green infrastructure, right? So you want to save space and you want to put permeable paving, you can park on top of it. For every 100 square feet of permeable paving, which is less than half of a parking space, you can get rid of one tree and one 100 square foot of landscape. You reduce that requirement by one tree. Same with the rain garden, which is just really a landscaped area that's kind of designed to capture water, as it runs off. 100 square feet of rain garden, you don't need your tree. Bioswale, 50 cubic feet, which is similar to that, but not all bioswales are created equal. So really that 375 gallon capacity, you reduce by one tree and 100 square feet. And these are not big numbers, these are very achievable. So while our requirement is slightly less than it was, it's still very hard to meet and ambitious. And if you are willing to give us some green infrastructure, you have a real incentive to do that, because you can really kind of reduce your requirement. You can save space, and of course, it has to do with the catchment area too. So, 50 cubic feet of bioretention with a catchment area of 1,000 square feet. Because we don't want you to put a bioswale on top of the hill, right? Because water doesn't flow uphill. But that's about the first half inch of rainfall that falls on your parking lot will be captured and saved from the sewer. So that's kind of the 3 requirements that we have for landscaping. It's the screening from streets, screening from residential districts, and landscaping and green infrastructure. So if you want to reduce that overall tree planting requirement, you can do that by giving us some permeable paving or bioswales or rain gardens integrated into your site plan, and you can just use that however it makes sense for your particular site. A few more things I'll point out in the guidebook that you should all have. Pass this one back. As we laid out some of the standards for some of the various elements that you'd combine to meet these requirements, and the code itself, if you go and look at it, is much more substantial and has a lot of definitions and a lot of things, but there's some highlights. But a few things I wanted to call out on this page. Planting area for a tree, you need 100 square feet of surface area for a tree. So no more 5x5 boxes. They kill trees, right? We're not going to, I don't think we stop you, right? But it's not going to count towards your requirement. You need 100 square feet, which is really 10 by 10 or 5 by 20. You need space for that tree to grow. Otherwise, it's never going to see its full potential. They were telling me 300 square feet, so this was a compromise. But that 10 by 10. Now there's provisions in the code too. If you do, there's this kind of suspended pavement systems. There's other permeable systems that can go on top. Our DPW uses a lot of those in their streetscapes nowadays. So there's other solutions if you just don't have the space, but that's the target. It's 100 square feet per tree. trees need to be 2.5-inch caliper. That's always been the requirement. That was the requirement in our code before. I think people tell me that's about the size of a beer can, or soda can, sorry. So that's, that's a pretty substantial tree, right? And talking to landscape architects, some of them have told me, well, if you plant a more mature tree and a young tree next to each other, you come back in 10 years, the smaller tree is going to overtake that tree because it's getting established where it is. So we don't want to, there wasn't a lot of appetite for reducing our standard because we want real trees. We don't want people to come plant twigs, but the new standard says, well, you can plant a younger tree, but you need 2 for 1. So if you want to plant 2 little trees in place of 1, that's fine. But they gotta stay there. Credit for existing canopy trees. So the old code had no provision to provide credit for existing trees, right? I think there might have been a standard that said you shall not remove any trees or something, but that's not always practical either. So people would cut them all down right before they went in for a permit, right? And so you see these great mature trees fell in order to plant a row of twigs, So now, if you have an existing tree, first of all, it counts, right? Why wouldn't it? If you have a tree on site, it counts towards your requirement. But furthermore, if you have some nice mature trees, they can count for more, right? As much so that if you have a tree that's, 18 inches or more, that counts for 3 trees now. So there's a real incentive, not a requirement per se, but an incentive to really save these mature trees and work around them, which can be a challenge. We also go into kind of various species of trees that have worked well in Milwaukee. This is not part of the codified code. This is more just to provide guidance. This came from the landscape architects we spoke with, as well as our forestry staff at DPW. And there's indicators in here. What trees work well where? Are they salt tolerant? Are they drought tolerant? Would they work in a bioswale? We also have standards for low-level plants. I won't talk too much about it other than to say this is kind of where we define how much you're required. So in those, when we talk about option A, option B, option C, we generally don't talk about the number of plants because I don't think we wanted people to focus on planting math, on parking lot math. What's the equation, X plus B equals how many shrubs I need? It's just plant some shrubs and grasses and trees. But there is a bare minimum that you need, and it's here, it's about half of what we used to require. But generally it's about 4 shrubs per 100 square feet. So 5-foot shrub spacing. It's not very onerous, it's very reasonable and achievable, and most really nicely designed landscapes will exceed it for the shrubs. And there's now we allow grasses and perennials, which is great. You could plant grasses if you wanted, but they didn't count for anything. You still needed that hedge. So now you can do a combination of things, and you can change it. Again, species of shrubs that have worked well. One thing that I'll credit one of my colleagues for encouraging us to add is whether or not a shrub is pet urine tolerant. We all kind of chuckled when we were told that, but it's true. People, especially in downtown or in really in dense mixed-use areas where there's a lot of development, it's very built up, but there's a lot of residential units, people have dogs, and I'm not going to plant landscaping. The dogs in the apartment building next door just come and pee on it and dies anyway. So we have indicators of what shrubs are pet urine tolerant. So that's kind of the basis of the landscape standards. But I have this image here looking at. So those standards apply to new sites, right? And as I kind of said at the beginning, we don't really have a lot of new greenfield development. Most of what we're doing is modifying what's there now. I mean, sure, there's the big splashy projects where we, knock it down and rebuild from scratch, but most of the time, where it's incremental changes over time to the built environment that we have. That wasn't always designed with these same goals, wasn't designed with threats of climate change in mind, wasn't designed with the appreciation of the public realm. So what do we do about sites like this? Is this there for perpetuity? Is there a way that we can compel this property owner to make some changes, even if it's not all the way there, to keep that water out of the streams and the rivers in the lake? So what we did in this code is we added an applicability section. So it's not in the guidebook, but actually the last section of the guidebook talks about the standards for existing sites, which are less. But when are you required to install landscaping, right? So the old code said, well, you're required to install landscaping when you build a new parking lot or when you reconstruct a parking lot. But reconstruction was never really defined, and it generally meant you starting over from scratch, a new parking lot, right? So then the repaving, all that work wasn't reconstruction. So we had a lot of discussion with DNS, with the city attorneys. What's the right trigger? We thought about, well, what about if a business has been vacant for 12 months? And we steered away from that, even though that would have been probably the path of least resistance, because we have a lot of vacant properties that we just don't want to put new burdens on, that we want to get reactivated. So generally we came down to, well, it's really about when you do that major repaving, that 20-year repaving, where you're really scraping off that top layer and laying that new, you got big equipment out there, that's when you should try to make some effort to move towards compliance. You see up there, it says change of use. I'll clarify, that's a change in use of what's being screened, not a change in use of the property. So if you have a parking lot that doesn't meet the standards and now it's a salvage yard, well, you change the use that's being screened. Not if you go from a rug store to a restaurant, that's not a change in use in this. I should clarify that in the slide. And then a substantial improvement to the property, which is generally if you completely renovate the building, you can't just leave the parking lot alone. So, this guy can't knock down that strip mall and build a new one and not address the parking lot. And in the code, it gets very detailed and specific about what triggers what. And so far, there haven't been any huge crises because of this. But this was a big move by our policymakers. It wasn't DCD per se that decided this. It was amongst all of us talking with each other about what do we do about those sites that are just in perpetuity the way they are. We also understand that retrofitting sites has specific challenges, right? So a site that was never designed to have this type of infrastructure, this green infrastructure, retrofitting it has its own challenges, right? So maybe we don't need to make them go all the way. So we have some reductions, right? So for the option A and B, the one with either the broad landscape area or the more standard landscape area with an ornamental fence, you can reduce that width in half if you're an existing site that's being required to comply. So if you need it to save your paving. So you don't have that 5 feet, what do you have, 3 feet? Okay, do the 3 feet, that's fine. You don't need to go to BOZA. It's just built into the code. It's part, there's no need to go to BOZA. If you want to do 10 feet, you don't want a fence, well, but you have 6 feet, well, that's fine, do your 6 feet. There's no BOZA required. It's built in. And then option C, that masonry wall, well, those are expensive, especially for a retrofit. So give us an ornamental metal fence with masonry piers, a point-based piers where you can avoid any underground issues, and that's all you need. You don't need ground level landscaping then. That's for retrofit. So a lot of times, buildings would come to the Board of Zoning Appeals for landscaping or for something unrelated to landscaping. So say you had a daycare center, and for some reason over time our policy makers have decided we don't like daycare centers so much so that we need to regulate them sometimes. So they'll be there for that special use privilege, and we will say, oh, while you're at it, landscape your parking lot. Well, if a cell phone store would have moved in there, we wouldn't have any leverage to get them to landscape their parking lot. So part of this is about leveling the playing field, I think, and making us more consistent. But in the case in BOZA, whether it's for landscaping or another use, in general, there'd be a compromise somewhere in the middle between what we require and what they can do. and we'd settle on that compromise. And then it becomes the specific requirement for that specific site, and then 10 years from now, we got to find that file and figure out what their landscaping plan was and what conditions there were and how many shrubs they needed. Well, this just kind of puts that compromise right into the code. All right, so if you can meet this, you don't need to go to BOSA. Here's another site that's tough, right? So generally, a double-loaded parking bay is 60 feet wide. You guys in the development industry know that. So, they probably recommend more like 63, 64. But 60 feet wide is a standard. These guys have about 52. So when they say, well, how much space do you have for landscaping? Well, they have -8 feet. So it's not like, oh, you got 63 feet and you only need 60, you can put a 3-foot. Well, they don't have space, right? Can this building owner tell all those tenants there that he's going to lose half their parking spaces? They're probably already feeling, whether it's real or perceived, that that it's limited. So what are the solutions? I mean, the old code would basically knock out half the parking to put that edge in, or require it, or at least 25% requiring it to go parallel on one side or angled. So this site was brought to my attention because they applied for a facade grant. They had a great proposal into our commercial corridor team that they wanted us to take a look at, and they really renovated the building. It looked great. I said, well, what are you going to do about that parking lot? It looks terrible, but I can feel for them, right? What can they do? Well, they gave us their proposal, and this is what they're planning, just to rebuild it, right, the way it is. So this was kind of while we were developing the code, but I came up with a little sketch for them. Well, what if you used a combination of things? Sometimes you had a buffer, you strategically took out some spots, you put some ground plantings near the sign. Some spots you don't have that strip, but you have an ornamental metal fence. So this would have came nowhere near close to meeting the old code, but under the new code, this can actually accomplish that. And they like this so much that they're now implementing this. So they're taking out the asphalt between the sidewalk and the curb, planting trees in there, in partnership with our DPW, of course, and those count. So it was a real win versus just giving them a variance and saying, oh, it doesn't fit, get a variance. Last thing I'll say before I turn it over to Q&A, when we announced, or when we spoke to the council committee about this, when we came and presented this at council for passage, we partnered it with some grant money. So we know that a lot more sites now are going to have to be made to come into compliance than they were before. So we also rolled out a grant program, we're calling parking lot beautification grants. It's actually administered through our eco office. But this gives, and we wrote this a little slightly different than our facade grant, so there's no going out and getting 3 different quotes and dealing with all that, because who are we to evaluate a landscaper's quote, we just said, you know what, let's just give them a base amount per element, right? So you want to plant a tree, we'll give you $150 for plant a tree. You want to remove existing paving, something that was paved, and make it permeable, let that water get into the ground, we'll give you $2 a square foot to do that. So think if you remove basically one parking space, that's about $500 or $600 that we'll give you just to remove the pavement. You want to put topsoil, some shrubs, some trees in there, you get more. So this was it's kind of a pilot at this point, but this was rolled out in unison with the new standards. So to give that kind of break and point people to a resource when they kind of feel overwhelmed about what to do, and we also walk them through some ideas on how to do it. Quickly, an example. This is West North Avenue. You can see the before above. This is over by Wellness Commons. It's across. This is the Social Development Commission's parking lot, and you can see the chain link and the curb and the asphalt there, and then the new retrofit that was done. Very simple. Just took a couple parking spots out and made that nice bioswale and a row of I think they're rose bushes along the street. Oh, it's quite pleasant. It's a big improvement. So that's my presentation. I can just leave this slide up here. for some resources. So I'm Kyle Gast, and you can email me or call me. I think my information might be in the book as well, or I can give you my card. We also, Milwaukee.gov/zoning code to read the code. If you're trying to design a parking lot, or you have questions about specific sites and you're familiar with zoning code and you think you can handle it, I would encourage you to actually go look at the code. We tried to write it as user-friendly as possible. Of course, our lawyers and our Legislative Reference Bureau like to add a lot of Old English into it, but it was meant to be user-friendly. And then for parking lot beautification grants, it's Milwaukee.gov/greenlots. And I will just add, I believe it's on that website. It talks about next year potentially rolling out commercial green infrastructure grants, which aren't tied specifically to parking lots, but that would be up to $25,000 per property for green infrastructure grants, and that can be partnered with the parking lot beautification grant, which is $8,000. So potentially you get up to $32,000 per property to add green infrastructure into that property. So thank you all very much. And again, my colleague Ed's here. If you came to learn about something other than landscape code, sorry that you had to sit through that, but we're willing to take your questions about this or about any other zoning related topic you may have. Thank you. Anyone? No? It was that clear, huh? Yeah.
Will the presentation be available online or via email?
Yes.
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 Mm-hmm. We have the link up there, Milwaukee.gov/landscape code. That'll have a PDF link to the document that you guys have, the little guidebook. That has a PDF, and I'll try to put this presentation on there as well. It'll be in addition to where the Lunch and Learn presentations are.
Is this change going to affect development plan areas, plan development?
In short, yes, general provisions applies to all districts, but plan developments are a little unique because a plan development, and for those of you who don't know, plan developments are generally that the property has zoning specific to that property. So maybe you don't really fit into any of our districts and you want to do a plan development. We negotiate a plan specific to that property, which includes landscaping. So all the landscaping maybe would be informed by these requirements, but actually technically the plan development is the requirement. So it's quite possible that the plan development might just say, refer to subchapter 4 for landscaping requirements, but the way our plan developments work, a lot of times it's down to every tree and every bush in the landscape plan that gets adopted. If that's what you meant by plan development, yeah, okay. Yes?
So what about screening from alleys? If we have a parking lot that's only accessible from an alley, how does that kind of shake out?
So for parking lots, so light motor vehicle parking lots, the parking of regular cars, there's no screening required from alleys. If you'd like to put a buffer on an alley, that'd be great. That counts towards your overall landscaping. But no, you put that landscaping where it's going to have the most, other than along the street and along the property line, put it where it's going to have the most environmental benefit or where it's going to grow the most. But there's no requirement to screen along alleys. Now, if you have more intense uses, say you have a salvage yard or a contractor's yard, or you're parking, semi trucks there are requirements to screen from view of non-industrial districts or residential, depending on what requirement it is. So in that case, if you had a use like that and you had a home across the street and you were parking semis there, or you were storing, salvage materials there, you would need to put some screening. But it would be to screen from the residential property. But along alleys, no. And there's no screening required along parking lots either. We don't have to screen a parking lot from a parking lot any longer. Okay, great. And I'll stick around in the lobby in case anyone thinks of any other questions.
Great. Thank you, Kyle, one more time. This concludes our 2019 Lunch and Learn, sponsored by the aldermen, especially Alderwoman Coggs. If you have any other questions, please let us know. Please take time to fill out the survey that we have given you at the beginning of the session. And thank you.